TSS True Scary Stories. Way Home. I live in Washington State in the Pacific Northwest. The area has winding roads through dense forests with an atmosphere that feels both cold and mysterious. Back then, I was 29 years old, working the late shift at a small diner off the highway, where the quiet night was occasionally broken by the sound of passing cars. Working until 2 a.m. wasn't easy, but I'd gotten used to it. People here were very different from the folks back home in the South, where I grew up. In the South, people were warm, friendly, and loved to chat. But here, everyone seemed reserved and less inclined to small talk. Most customers just wanted to eat, pay, and leave, which honestly made my job easier. One night, close to closing time, it was just me and the cook, Ethan, left in the diner. It was about 1:50 a.m., and while we were counting down the minutes until closing, a large man walked in. He looked awkwardly dressed, a tucked-in gray shirt, a worn brown jacket, and jeans pulled up way too high. He had brown glasses, a thick mustache, and an unsettling smile. He walked up to the counter and introduced himself. "My name's Victor," he said. "I'll take a black coffee and some French toast." His voice was low and gravelly, with a mix of friendliness and something else I couldn't quite place. Trying to be polite, I forced a smile. "All right, Victor. Coming right up." I went to the kitchen and told Ethan the order, feeling Victor's gaze follow me the whole way. As Victor started eating, he struck up a conversation, something that late-night customers rarely did. He asked if I was from around here and mentioned that he'd just moved to town. Then he complained about the potholes, his tone oddly insistent. I answered vaguely, giving as little information as possible. Victor didn't seem to mind my short answers, as if he was content just watching me. There was something in his eyes that made me feel deeply uncomfortable, and I couldn't wait for him to leave. When Victor finished his meal and paid, I quickly cleaned his table and prepared to go. I walked out to the parking lot, where I saw 3 cars, mine, Ethan's, and an older silver car parked close to the highway entrance. I wondered if it belonged to Victor, but I quickly brushed it off, eager to get home and shake off this strange night. Driving along the empty highway, I couldn't help but feel uneasy, thinking about Victor's unsettling days. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden warning from my car's dashboard. My rear passenger tire was losing pressure. I'd never had a flat before and started to feel a bit panicked as the car shook more and more. I had no choice but to pull over. Stepping out of the car, I could feel the chill of the late night. Under the dim glow of my headlights, I saw the tire was completely flat. Just then, headlights approached, pulling up close behind me. My heart stopped when I recognized the man getting out. It was Victor. He walked toward me, waving and smiling, as if meeting here was just a coincidence. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone friendly but strangely unsettling. I rolled down my window just a crack, trying to hide my fear. He offered to help change the tire and told me to get out of the car. I declined, saying my boyfriend was on his way. Meanwhile, I secretly dialed 911, setting my phone on my lap, hoping the dispatcher would hear what was going on. Victor stood there in silence for a moment, his gaze growing colder. Without warning, He smashed his fist into the window beside me, shattering it. Glass rained down onto my lap as I screamed. I held up my phone, yelling that I was calling the police. But instead of backing off, Victor reached through the broken window, grabbed my phone, and threw it toward the highway, then quickly ran back to his car and sped off into the night. I sat frozen in my car, surrounded by the darkness and silence that now felt even more terrifying. Too scared to leave my car and look for my phone, I could only wait, praying he wouldn't come back. After what felt like an eternity, I finally heard police sirens approaching. I stepped out of the car, waving frantically, and pointed in the direction Victor had gone. The officers found my phone, though it was completely broken. They listened to my story, changed my tire, and one of them even escorted me home. That night, I barely slept, haunted by Victor's cold gaze and what he'd done. A week later, I received a call from the police informing me that the investigation was still ongoing, but they hadn't found any trace of Victor. Not knowing where he was made me even more uneasy, wondering if he was still out there, waiting for another chance. After that night, I decided never to go back to that diner job. The fear and unease had burrowed too deep into my mind, and I didn't want to risk encountering him again. Stranger on the street. I work at a small gas station on the outskirts of town, where only a few customers stop by late at night. Over time, I've grown used to the quiet, the chill, and sometimes even the unsettling appearances of certain customers. That night, I had just finished my shift and was getting ready to drive home. The route back was a long, desolate stretch of highway winding through thick forests. There were almost no streetlights, just the faint glow of the trees along the sides. I drove in silence, my radio barely audible, occasionally glancing in my rearview mirror. At first, the road was completely empty, with only the darkness surrounding me. About 10 minutes after leaving the station, I noticed headlights from a car far behind me. Initially, I didn't think much of it, figuring it was just another car on the road. But as I picked up speed, the car behind me kept the same pace, almost like a shadow. I slowed down, hoping it would pass me. Instead, it slowed down too, staying dangerously close. Its headlights glared into my rearview mirror, making it hard to see and making my heart start to race. I switched lanes to the right, hoping the car would pass, but it mirrored my movement, sticking close, like it was following my every turn. Fear started to creep up inside me. I couldn't figure out this driver's intentions, and the isolation on the dark road only made it worse. With no other options, I decided to pull over, thinking the car would just drive past if I stopped. But when I pulled over, the car behind me pulled over too, stopping only a few feet away. Looking in my rearview mirror, I saw a man slowly step out of the car. The headlights were so bright I couldn't make out his face, but I could tell he was tall, solidly built, and moving toward me with a slow, deliberate gait. My heart pounded as I fumbled to call 911, trying to stay calm. The man approached my window and tapped on it lightly, his movements slow, eerie, and calculated. When I looked over, I could make out his thin face and dark eyes glinting in the headlights. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Instead, It was a twisted grin, filled with an unmistakable malice. He motioned as if he just wanted to talk. I shook my head, gripping my phone tightly and speaking softly to the 911 operator about my situation. The operator on the other end tried to keep me calm, telling me to stay in the car. The man stood still, not moving, his eyes fixed on me through the window. At that moment, he began to speak. His voice echoed in the night, sending a chill down my spine. "Do you think you'll make it home safely?" he asked, his tone mocking. "It's not safe to drive alone this late." Swallowing my fear, I whispered my location to the 911 operator, hoping for a quick response. After a few more seconds of silence, the man stopped talking, still watching me intently. Suddenly, he turned and walked back to his car, but before getting in, he looked back one last time, his eyes cold and bright, his twisted grin still there, like he was promising he'd be back. Then he sped off, leaving me frozen in my car, trying to steady my breathing and calm my nerves. About 10 minutes later, I finally saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching. I stepped out, frantically waving to them and recounting everything that had just happened. The police officers listened carefully, reassured me, and offered to escort me home. Though I made it back safely, I couldn't sleep at all that night. The man's face, his cold stare, and that chilling grin haunted my thoughts as if they were burned into my memory. The police said they'd try to find the car, but whether they did or not, I knew the terror of that night would remain a dark shadow in my mind forever. Followers. I work at a small bookstore downtown, a quiet place with an old-fashioned, almost eerie atmosphere. During the day, the bookstore is full of natural light and customers browsing peacefully. But at night, when it's just me and the towering shelves, the silence becomes almost suffocating. My footsteps echo on the wooden floors, and every slight movement feels unsettling. Whenever I work the closing shift, I keep all the lights on because the darkness here feels like it's hiding something, watching. One rainy night, about an hour before closing, a man walked in. He wore a long, rain-soaked black coat and a hat pulled low, hiding most of his face. I greeted him out of habit, but he didn't respond, only giving me a short nod before drifting into the aisles. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost like he was gliding. At first, I thought he was just another customer browsing for a late-night read, but as I glanced over from behind the counter, something about him felt off. He wasn't browsing. He stood perfectly still between two shelves, his back turned to me, staring into the darkness of the aisle. Minutes passed, but he didn't move an inch. An uneasy feeling settled in, making me shiver. There was something disturbingly unnatural about his presence. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then I looked up and froze. He was staring at me through the gap between two bookshelves, his eyes dark and unblinking, piercing in a way that made me feel exposed. Even from a distance, I could feel the intensity of his gaze, sharp and menacing. After several long minutes of uncomfortable silence, he began to walk toward the counter. His movements were slow and deliberate, each step seeming to test my resolve. When he reached the counter, he didn't ask for help or greet me, just stood there, watching me with a look that made my skin crawl. Finally, I gathered the courage to ask if he needed help. He didn't answer my question. Instead, in a voice as cold and dark as the rain outside, he asked, "Have you ever felt like someone is always watching you?" My heart pounded as I struggled to respond. He wasn't smiling. His eyes didn't blink, and his face remained hidden under the hat. But his stare was relentless, cutting right through me. It felt like he was searching for something inside me, a secret he already knew. After what felt like an eternity, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the aisles again. I was left standing there, shaken, watching his tall, dark figure vanish between the rows of books. I waited a few minutes, hoping to hear the doorbell chime as he left, but there was only silence. Something didn't feel right. I decided to check the aisles, making sure he was gone, but I couldn't find him anywhere. The bookstore was empty, or so it seemed. I was alone, surrounded by nothing but the quiet and the shadows of the shelves. But the air felt heavy, as if something unseen was still lurking in the darkness. Trying to regain my composure, I returned to the counter, but as I glanced into the mirror behind me, I felt a chill run down my spine. One of the books on the shelf directly behind me was sticking out, as if someone had just pulled it. The title made my blood run cold, The Watcher. I didn't remember arranging the book that way, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow still here. The silence grew oppressive, and I couldn't bring myself to turn my back on the aisles, afraid that his eyes would meet mine in the reflection. Finally, it was closing time. I quickly locked up and hurried outside, the rain pouring down in icy sheets. As I turned back to lock the door, I glanced through the glass and froze. Standing in the darkness of the store, just barely visible, was the man in the black coat and hat. He stood there motionless, watching me. I blinked, and he was gone. The entire drive home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. My eyes darted to the rearview mirror constantly, and every sound seemed amplified, making me feel as though someone was right behind me. When I got home, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and turning off every light except my phone screen. That night, I couldn't sleep. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get his face, his chilling words, and the memory of him standing in the darkness out of my head. It was as if he'd planted himself in my mind, a shadow I would never fully escape. The Late Night Caller. I've always been a night owl, and so are most of my friends, so it's not unusual for me to get calls late at night. But one October night, right as the clock struck 2 of May, my phone rang with an unknown number. Thinking it might just be someone dialing the wrong number, I picked up without a second thought. "Hello?" I answered, my voice a little drowsy. For a moment, there was silence. Then a faint voice, shaky and barely audible, broke through. The tone was desperate, sending a shiver down my spine. Can you help me?" The voice was so quiet, it sounded like a whisper, as if the person on the other end didn't want to be overheard. The voice continued, "I'm lost, and I don't know where I am." My heart began to race. There was something about that voice, some kind of dread embedded in every word, that filled me with unease. "Where are you? Can you tell me more?" I asked, straining to listen. There was a long pause, only the sound of labored breathing coming through. After several seconds, The voice returned, even weaker, as if the person was running out of strength. "It's so dark and so cold." I could feel the fear in that voice, a fear so intense it was almost infectious. Trying to steady myself, I asked, "Are you still there? Is anyone else around you?" Again, there was no immediate answer, only the sound of faint rustling, as if the person was moving or shifting. Then a chilling statement, spoken just above a whisper. "Do you hear it? The footsteps." I didn't hear anything on my end, just the weak voice and its trembling tone, but the eerie feeling was now undeniable. "Where are you?" I asked, trying to hide the tremor in my own voice. "I can call someone to help you." The line went silent again. After a painfully long pause, the person finally responded, whispering so close to the phone it almost felt like they were right beside me. "I don't know. I see a light up ahead." Then, without warning, the call disconnected. I stared at my phone, unnerved by this sudden silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably a prank or a wrong number. But I couldn't rid myself of the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in my chest. The next morning, I woke up to a text from the unknown number. It was a single line that sent chills through me. "Thank you for listening." My heart skipped a beat. How did they know I'd listened to the call? A wave of anxiety washed over me as I realized this was something beyond a simple prank. When I tried to trace the number, my search returned only one message: "This number does not exist." The following night, at exactly 2 a.m., my phone rang again. This time, I saw that same unknown number flashing on the screen. I hesitated, dread building in my chest, but curiosity and fear pushed me to answer. The same weak voice greeted me. I'm so cold. Can you help me?" I froze, feeling as though I were trapped in some twisted nightmare. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, but I could feel my hands starting to shake. There was no immediate answer, only the faint sound of footsteps, slow and steady, as if someone were wandering in a dark, empty space. The voice, now even softer, replied, "I'm right outside the door." My heart raced as I turned my gaze toward my front door, which was shrouded in darkness. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I strained to hear anything on the other side of the door. But there was only an oppressive silence. Just then, my phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. This time, it read, "Thank you for listening." That night, sleep eluded me completely. No matter how much I tried to convince myself that this was some kind of sick prank, the fear continued to gnaw at me. Every time my phone buzzed late at night, I felt the paralyzing dread that the voice would call again. The next day, I told a few friends about the strange calls and texts, but no one took me seriously. One friend even joked that I was overthinking it and probably just tired. On the third night, I promised myself I wouldn't answer the call if it came. But right at 2 a.m., my phone rang again. I glanced at the screen and saw the same number, though this time it looked distorted, almost as if it were glitching. I stood frozen, battling between the fear and a sick sense of curiosity. After a moment, I decided not to answer, but then my phone buzzed with a new message. "Please, don't ignore me." A wave of terror washed over me as I picked up the phone with trembling hands and typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came almost immediately with just one sentence. I just wanted someone to hear me. I didn't know what to say, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. I typed out another message asking, "What do you want?" But this time, there was no response. The rest of the night, I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening for any sound outside my door, any whisper in the shadows. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could feel an eerie presence, like something was lingering just out of sight, watching me from the darkness. The next day, I decided to delete the number from my phone and change my own phone number, hoping to end this nightmare. But despite my efforts, every night at 2 a.m. received a message that simply read, "Thank you for listening." From that point on, I lived with a constant sense of unease, as if that faint, desperate voice was now haunting my every step. No matter how many times I tried to forget it, every time I heard my phone buzz in the dead of night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was still out there, watching and waiting. Noises in the basement. Jenna was a young woman living alone in her grandparents' old house in a quiet suburb of Illinois. This house held fond memories of her childhood, where she spent many summers. But there was one place that had always made Jenna uneasy, even when she was young: the basement. Ever since she was a child, she had felt an unsettling presence whenever she was down there, as if a pair of invisible eyes were watching her from the shadows. Now, years later, she couldn't shake the feeling every time she had to go down there alone. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with shadows that seemed to cling to the walls. The space always felt oppressive, even when the light was on. Jenna avoided it as much as possible, but on a rainy October night, she was jolted awake by a strange sound coming from the basement. She checked the time on her phone: 3 a.m. At first, she tried to convince herself it was just the house settling. After all, the home was old, and these things happened. But the sound continued, a scraping noise, slow and deliberate, as though something heavy was being dragged across the concrete floor. Heart pounding, Jenna grabbed her phone, turned on the flashlight, and reluctantly made her way to the basement door. The sound grew louder as she approached, more distinct and unsettling. Taking a deep breath, she slowly opened the basement door. The stairs creaked under her weight as she made her way down. She could feel the chill in the air intensifying as she descended, as if she were stepping into an ice-cold cavern. The beam from her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating cobwebs and old boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. When she reached the bottom, she froze. The floor was smeared with muddy footprints, large and fresh, leading from the corner of the basement toward the center of the room. Jenna knew these weren't her footprints. She hadn't set foot down here in days, and no one else had a key to the house. She traced the trail with her flashlight, her pulse racing. At the end of the trail was an old, weathered trunk, covered in dust and grime. Jenna didn't recall ever seeing it before. It was as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Swallowing her fear, she moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached out to lift the lid. The second her hand touched the trunk, a loud thud echoed behind her. She spun around, flashlight flickering. There was no one there. just empty shadows and eerie silence. Jenna turned back to the trunk, curiosity overwhelming her fear. She opened it slowly, and an overwhelming smell of mold and decay filled the air. Inside were old, yellowed papers and black and white photographs that looked decades old. She picked up a photo and gasped. It was a picture of her grandparents standing next to a man she didn't recognize. A man with hollow eyes and an eerie, expressionless face. He looked familiar, yet Jenna couldn't place him. At that moment, she heard footsteps behind her. The sound was unmistakable, each step slow and heavy, coming closer and closer. She spun around, pointing her flashlight wildly. No one was there, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. Jenna felt compelled to look toward the far wall, where an old mirror hung, cracked and dusty. In the reflection, she saw a shadowy figure standing directly behind her. A man with a pale face, wet hair clinging to his forehead, and dark, empty eyes. She screamed and whipped around, but the room was empty. Heart racing, she dashed up the stairs, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, breathing heavily. But just as she thought she was safe, she heard it, the scraping sound, slowly ascending the stairs from the basement. From that night on, avoided the basement at all costs. Every night at 3 a.m., without fail, the dragging sound would begin again, moving from the depths of the basement to the foot of the stairs, then stopping just behind the door, as if someone or something was waiting there, patient and persistent. Jenna knew she couldn't stay in the house any longer. She packed her things and moved out, but on her final night in the house, just before she closed the door behind her, she glanced back one last time. In the basement window, barely visible in the pale moonlight, she saw the shadow of a man with hollow, lifeless eyes watching her as she walked away, a reminder that he would always be there, waiting for the next person to disturb his hidden secrets in the cold, silent basement. The Watcher in the Dark. I was 18 that year, fresh off a college acceptance letter that made me feel more freedom than ever. My 2 best friends, Ryan and Matt, had also gotten into college, so we decided to make this summer unforgettable. We planned one weekend night at a secluded beach, just dunes, waves crashing, and a starlit sky. Our plan was to pick up 2 girls from our school who we all had a bit of a crush on. Let's call them Ava and Grace. That night, we got some snacks, soft drinks, a few beers, and hit the road. The beach was far from town, accessible only by a narrow dirt road. By the time we got there, it was close to 10 p.m., with a light sea breeze blowing, and everything seemed perfect for a night out. We spread out blankets, put on some music, and started talking about everything and nothing. Time passed with laughter, stories, and the mesmerizing stars above. After a few hours, Ava and I decided to take a walk down the beach, leaving Ryan and Matt with Grace. We wandered off, letting the waves fill the silence and the moonlight light our way. When we reached a quiet, more private spot, I laid out a blanket, and we sat down to watch the stars. Everything seemed perfect until Ava suddenly whispered, "Do you feel like we're being watched?" At first, I just laughed and told her not to worry. But then, as I listened closely, I heard something, a soft, crunching sound, like footsteps on the sand, as if someone was moving around us. An eerie chill crept over me. I squeezed Ava's hand and we both went silent, listening. Suddenly, from the top of a nearby sand dune, a flashlight beam flared up, aimed right at us. In the dim light, I could make out a shadowy figure standing there, staring. I quickly pulled Ava to her feet, and we hurried back to where Ryan and Matt were. As we walked, the footsteps continued behind us, steady and slow, as if whoever was there wanted us to know they were following. My heart pounded, and when I glanced back, all I could see was darkness swallowing the beach. When we made it back to the group, I told them what had happened. Ryan and Matt instantly turned off the music and looked around, but all we could see was endless night and hear the distant sound of waves. An uneasy feeling settled over us, so we decided it was best to head back to the car. Once inside, I realized I must have dropped my phone while we were running. We all agreed not to go back for it, but just as I started the engine, my phone buzzed from somewhere in the car. It must have slipped into the seat gap, and I hadn't noticed. I picked it up and saw an incoming call from an unknown number. I thought it might be a wrong number, but when I answered, all I heard was slow, heavy breathing. Fear gripped me, and I quickly hung up, driving away from the beach as fast as I could. The whole drive back was completely silent. None of us said a word. When we got to town, my phone buzzed again with a message notification. I opened it, and my stomach twisted. It was a photo, taken from above, of Ava and me on the blanket. Whoever had been watching us had taken it from the dune. Everyone in the car was horrified. Ryan and Matt checked their phones and saw something even worse. AirTag detected moving with you. Someone had placed a tracking device on our car. Under the streetlight, we all frantically searched the car and finally found an AirTag taped under one of my tires. We threw it out immediately, but the fear stuck with us. Over the following weeks, every time I went out at night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever it was still lurking in the shadows. Then, 3 weeks after that creepy night, on a Sunday morning, I received a package. No return address, no name, just a thick envelope with photos inside. They were all from that night at the beach, capturing private moments between me and Ava. My stomach churned. I could only imagine how horrified Ava would feel if she saw them. We didn't know what to do, so we called the police. They came to collect the photos and checked for fingerprints, but nothing turned up. Ava was terrified that whoever took the photos would use them to blackmail her, and I was afraid of the same. That experience changed us all. Every time I think back, I still get chills. The photos, the footsteps, the shadow on the dune, everything is a haunting reminder that someone out there was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make themselves known, or worse, watching still, just beyond the shadows. Beach Watchers. When I was 19, my best friend, Mark, and I lived pretty comfortable lives. I know it sounds pretentious, but we both came from well-off families in North Jersey and often spent our summers down at the Jersey Shore. I lived in Belmer, New Jersey, while his family's house was in Lavallette. It was a typical summer night during the week, and Mark was driving us from my place in Belmer down to Lavallette, about an hour's drive. The warm summer night air gave us a sense of excitement, the feeling that anything could happen. Honestly, I preferred hanging out at Mark's house. Not just because it was a bit nicer, but because Lavalette had this laid-back vibe that just felt right for our age group. It was quieter, with fewer tourists and more hidden beaches that only locals knew about. If we weren't out looking for a party, we'd grab a couple of beers, roll a joint, and head to one of the private beaches where, technically, we weren't supposed to be. But at night, it was easy to keep a low profile and blend into the shadows. On the way down, we talked about how we wanted to spend the evening. We both agreed it would be a calm, chill night, no big parties or anything wild. Our plan was simple: grab a few beers, roll a joint, and relax on a quiet beach under the stars. The idea sounded perfect. We'd been going pretty hard with our other friends lately, and a peaceful night with just the two of us sounded like the perfect way to unwind. Lavalette has two main beach areas, the ocean side and the bay side. Most of the beaches there have tall, steep sand dunes leading down to the shore. When you stand at the water's edge and look back, there's this huge hill of sand towering behind you. It's beautiful, but at night it can also feel remote and a little eerie. After a few beers at Mark's place, we grabbed a couple of bikes from his garage and rode down to one of our favorite spots. However, this time, Mark was feeling more adventurous and insisted we go farther than usual, choosing a deserted beach at the very end of the road with no cars parked nearby. Every house on the street was dark, and the whole area was silent and empty. The only sounds were our bikes crunching over the gravel path and the faint crashing of waves in the distance. There was something eerie but thrilling about it. We stashed our bikes under some shrubs and headed out onto the sand. The beach stretched out in both directions, and we couldn't see a single other soul. Mark and I settled down, lit up a joint, and leaned back, letting the sounds of the waves and the cool night air settle over us. The stars were especially bright that night, and the sand felt cool under our feet. We laughed, talked about school, reminisced about summer memories, and traded stories about people we knew. Eventually, both of us lay back, staring up at the sky and talking about things as deep as future dreams and as random as whether we'd see a shooting star. Then I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought I'd imagined it, just a soft, almost metallic buzzing sound, like a low hum you'd hear in a big empty warehouse. It didn't make any sense out there on the beach. I sat up, squinting into the darkness, and saw Mark was doing the same. The sound was strange, subtle, and felt out of place. It was the kind of sound you'd expect from machinery, like a large fluorescent light buzzing in the distance. We both turned our heads, looking for where it was coming from, but it was too faint to pinpoint. We exchanged nervous glances, trying to laugh it off, but a sense of unease crept up on us. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a distant boat, maybe the wind doing something strange, but the thought didn't comfort me. And it didn't comfort Mark either. The noise continued, a steady, soft hum that seemed to drift around us. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore. Minutes passed, and finally, Mark gestured that maybe it was time to head back. I nodded, but just as we stood up, the buzzing noise suddenly grew louder, so loud that it felt like it was surrounding us, vibrating in the air. It wasn't a gradual increase. It was instant. from a soft hum to a noise that seemed to penetrate the silence around us. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and a wave of fear washed over me. The buzzing seemed to be coming from our right, from the direction of the dunes. We stood there, frozen, looking into the darkness. There was nothing to be seen, only shadows stretching out along the sand. I could feel my pulse pounding, the kind of fear that's so intense you don't even know if you can move. But then, just when I thought we might be overreacting, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the top of the dune, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, there was a figure. A tall, dark silhouette, standing perfectly still. The figure's arms were abnormally long, nearly reaching down to its knees, and it stood there, motionless, as if watching us. The outline of it was terrifying, looming, and unnatural. In the dim light, I couldn't make out any details, no face, no movement. Just a tall, eerie shape. Mark grabbed my arm, his face pale in the dim starlight. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. We both turned and started running, not caring about anything except putting distance between us and that figure. The sand made it hard to run fast, but we pushed forward, our breaths coming in shallow gasps. We reached another dune entrance and climbed up, hoping to lose whatever or whoever that thing was. Once we reached the top, we looked back to where we had been. My blood ran cold. Not only was the figure still there, but now there were more of them, 3 or 4 dark silhouettes, all standing on the dunes, perfectly still, facing in our direction. It was like something out of a nightmare. We had left our bikes by the bushes, but there was no way we were going back. We turned and sprinted all the way back to Mark's house, the adrenaline and fear propelling us forward. It felt like we were being watched the whole way, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see one of those figures following us. The next morning, after we had calmed down, we went back to the beach to look for our bikes, but they were gone. We searched up and down the beach, looking in the bush and along the shoreline, but there was no sign of them. We talked about it, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but none of it made sense. Maybe someone had stolen them. Or maybe whatever had been watching us had something to do with it. To this day, that night haunts me. I can still hear the buzzing sound, that unnatural hum that seemed to come out of nowhere. And I can still see those figures on the dunes, dark and motionless, watching us in silence. The Shadow Under the Lake. My name is Ryan, and I've always loved fishing. Every weekend, I drive out to a remote lake deep in the Colorado mountains to relax and find some peace away from everything. The lake was isolated, surrounded by dense forests and shadowy mountain peaks, making it feel like a forbidden place, far removed from the outside world. The solitude there always felt soothing to me. Until one night that I'll never forget. It was late in the evening when it happened. The sun had already set behind the mountains, and the silver glow of the moon began to rise, casting an eerie light over the lake. The air was still and heavy, cold enough to make my breath fog up in front of me. I sat at the water's edge, watching my fishing float bob on the blackened water. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange. A dark shape moving just beneath the water's surface. At first, I thought it might be a large fish, but then I realized it didn't look like any fish I'd ever seen. It was too large, too shapeless, and had this unnerving way of moving as if it were watching me. An icy chill crept up my spine as I felt an unshakable feeling that a pair of invisible eyes were staring up at me from the depths below. Trying to brush off my unease, I told myself it was just a trick of the moonlight, nothing more. But the dark shadow in the water kept drifting closer to the shore where I was sitting. The water under my feet seemed to grow darker, as if it were swallowing up any light that touched it. Each second passed slower than the last, and that shadow seemed to be growing, almost like it was crawling its way up toward me. As I decided to stand up and leave, a strange, heavy sensation pressed down on me, as if something were pulling me back. Then, I felt a sudden freezing grip around my ankle. I looked down, and there, emerging from the water, was a pale, ghostly hand, thin and bony, clamping tightly around my leg. The hand was ice-cold and rigid as iron. Its fingers were long and skeletal, with jagged cracked nails. I could feel the bone-chilling cold radiate from it, spreading through my leg. In absolute panic, I tried to pull my foot free, but the hand's grip was unbelievably strong, like a vice that wouldn't let go. I started yelling, but in the empty, silent night, my voice sounded small, like it was lost in the darkness around me. I clawed at the ground, using every ounce of strength to pull myself away, but the hand kept pulling me down, inch by inch, toward the cold, black water. I could feel myself slipping, like I was being dragged into the lake, into the shadowy abyss below. In a moment of terror, I turned back to see what was holding me. Rising from the water was a face, a pale, lifeless face with hollow, empty eyes staring straight through me. The mouth of that ghostly figure began to open, as if it were trying to say something, but no sound came out. Just water spilling from its lips, seeping through its cracked teeth, making a faint, haunting noise as it trickled back into the lake. I screamed and kicked with everything I had, jamming my free foot against the skeletal hand gripping my leg. Finally, with one last desperate kick, I managed to break free and fell backward onto the bank, gasping for breath. Without hesitation, I scrambled to my feet and ran, sprinting away from the lake as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my whole body still numb from the freezing grip of that hand. I turned back for one final look, and the lake was as calm and silent as ever, as if nothing had happened. The next day, after calming down a bit, I decided to share my story with a local friend. He listened with a solemn expression before he looked me in the eye and said, "You probably encountered something we locals don't talk about. That lake has seen many mysterious drownings, and most of the bodies were never recovered. They say the souls of those who died there never leave. They're trapped in the water, waiting for someone to pull down with them. I've never gone back to that lake, but no matter how hard I try, I can't forget that lifeless face or those empty eyes that seem to stare straight into my soul. Sometimes in my nightmares, I find myself back at that lake's edge, and from the depths of the water, that icy hand reaches up once more, trying to drag me down into the darkness forever. The Whisper in the Woods. My name is John. I'm an avid hiker and lover of the outdoors, and almost every weekend, I make my way to a secluded forest in North Carolina to escape the noise and chaos of the city. The forest is dense, almost forgotten, and few people even know about it. I've always loved the feeling of being surrounded by trees, hearing only the wind and the birds, with nothing but silence for company. One night, after a long day of hiking, I decided to set up camp and stay overnight. I pitched my tent by the base of a large tree, built a small campfire to keep the night chill at bay, and sat by the flames, feeling completely at peace. The only sounds were the hum of insects and the rustling of leaves in the trees around me. I watched the fire dance and felt completely at ease. But as the night grew darker, I began to hear something strange. It was a soft whisper coming from somewhere deep in the woods. At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just the wind. But the whisper kept repeating, faint yet unmistakable, like a distant voice calling out from the shadows. I sat there, silent, trying to listen closer, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. And then my heart froze as I heard it clearly. It was calling my name. John. John. It was distant, faint but distinct, as if someone out there was calling me from within the darkness. A chill crept up my spine, and I felt a fear I couldn't explain. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was just tired. But the voice didn't stop. The whisper became louder, more persistent, and it sounded as though it was getting closer. I shone my flashlight into the trees, sweeping over the underbrush and shadows, but there was nothing. Just as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw it, a figure standing among the trees. It was a woman, still and silent, staring in my direction, but her face, it was blank. She had no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a featureless, smooth face as if it had been wiped clean. She stood there, facing me, her blank face somehow fixed on me, sending chills through my entire body. I stood there, paralyzed, my hand shaking as I held my flashlight. The figure didn't move, but the whisper grew louder, echoing in my head, calling my name over and over. It was soft but relentless, drawing me toward it like a lure. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I darted into my tent, frantically packed up my things and ran. I didn't look back, not once, but I could feel her presence lingering behind me. The whisper followed me, haunting me as I sprinted out of the forest, its voice echoing through the trees. The next day, I told a friend from the area what had happened. His face went pale as he listened, and he told me the local legend of a woman who had disappeared in those woods many years ago. People say her spirit still wanders, searching for someone to take her place in the shadows, calling out to those who enter, hoping to keep them there forever. Since that night, I've never gone back to that forest. But sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet, I still hear that faint whisper calling my name in the wind, a chilling reminder of what I encountered in that dark, haunted forest. If you find my story interesting, please like and subscribe to wait for our better stories every day.